in the Middle East a very ancient and a very great civilization, which for 1,000 years or so was in the very forefront of human endeavor. It was the richest, strongest, most powerful, most wealthy of all living societies. It was also on the cutting edge of science, technology, in virtually every field. And then suddenly, within a very short period, this society is eclipsed by, is overshadowed, outperformed in almost every respect by what they had hitherto regarded as the ignorant, barbarous infidels beyond the northwestern frontier, namely Christian Europe. Suddenly, instead of winning every war, they lost every war. They were beaten in battle again and again. They who had been accustomed to unending triumphs and victories, the defeats on the battlefield at the peripheries didn't matter so much. But when they were defeated at the very center, and when the greatest of the Muslim powers, the Ottoman Empire, was forced by victorious enemies to surrender and sign a peace treaty, in effect imposed by the enemy, that concentrated the mind wonderfully and began a debate. This was just over 300 years ago, in 1699. And the debate has been going on ever since. It begins with the military. The question is asked at the time, hitherto we have always defeated the infidels, now the infidels are defeating us. Why? What went wrong? Then defeat in the battlefield was matched by defeat in the marketplace. Suddenly, Western economies began to develop while theirs became stagnant, so that even things which they regarded as peculiarly their own were better done elsewhere. Then they found themselves outperformed politically. They looked for the reasons for their relative failure compared with Western success. And they tried a number of things. They started with the military. They modernized their armies. They adopted Western methods, Western weapons, Western drill, and so on. But it didn't help. They still lost war after war. They decided that it must be the economy. So they tried to industrialize, forced industrialization by the state. And that didn't work very well either. And then they decided that it must be the political systems of the West, that the magic talisman of Western wealth and power was elected assemblies, something entirely alien to their experience. So they tried that, and none of it has worked. And this has been going on now for 3 centuries. And it got worse and worse. Not only were they outperformed by the West, they came to be dominated by the West, as most of the Islamic world, with very few exceptions, came under the rule of one or other of the great European imperial powers, Britain, France, Holland, and Russia. And this is a debate which has been going on for 3 centuries and has been getting more and more ramified, and all kinds of explanations have been offered. And what I tried to do in this book is to look at some of the various explanations that have been offered against the background of the changes which have actually been taking place.
How long have you been writing about the Middle East, thinking about it?
Oh, since I was an undergraduate.
Where?
That was in the University of London in the mid-1930s.
And what got your interest in it going in the first place?
Idle curiosity. I was going to be a lawyer. It never occurred to me that one could actually earn a living by doing this sort of stuff. I was going to be a lawyer, so I could take my BA in whatever amused me. And I did history, and then I specialized in Middle Eastern history. And in order to do that better, I learned a couple of Middle Eastern languages.
What'd you learn?
Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, Turkish.
You still speak them?
Well, I'm getting a bit rusty in some of them. As I grow older, my fluency diminishes, but I can still read them.
Did you travel to that part of the world?
Oh, yes, I've traveled extensively. And then between 1940 and 1945, I was on His Majesty's service, and that gave me an opportunity to see the modern Middle East. Until then, my interests had been mainly medieval, and this gave me a chance to make the acquaintance of the modern Middle East and travel around quite a lot. It gave me a somewhat different perspective.
Now, you're a professor emeritus at Princeton.
That is right.
How long did you spend at Princeton?
I went to Princeton in '74.
Where were you before that?
The University of London.
Teaching what?
The history of the Middle East.
As I got ready to sit down and talk about this book, I read a bunch of articles, and they actually you couldn't avoid them in the last couple of weeks. And as I did, I kept seeing the same thing. I don't even know if you've had a chance to see all this. I want to show it, put it on the screen. And these are quotes that I read from others writing about you. Let's start with the first one. You'll see it here on the screen in just a second. Now, there we go. Bernard Lewis, the great Islamic scholar and author. Michael Kelly, The Washington Post, October 24th. Bernard Lewis is first and foremost a historian, arguably the most respected Islamic scholar in the West. James Clearfield in Newsday. Got two more. Mr. Lewis is arguably the West's premier student of the Near East. That's George Will. Princeton professor emeritus Bernard Lewis, 85, is arguably the West's most distinguished scholar on the Middle East. Now, these are people that, most observers say on different sides of the political fence. I happen to have two magazine articles here. I don't know that I've ever seen anybody do this before. Here's the cover of the New Yorker, which we'll see in just a second. And you have the lead story in the New Yorker, Islam in Revolt. And this was just a couple of weeks ago. And then right after that, in December, you had National Review and the lead article there. What's going on here? Why are all these people saying these things about you?
Well, I'm very flattered, of course, by these remarks that you have quoted, and I would be more or less than human if I didn't enjoy them. On the other hand, it isn't quite true to say undisputed. There are people who would disagree very strongly with these assessments of what I have accomplished, but let's not go into that. Why now particularly? I think probably for two reasons. I've been writing about the Middle East for years and years and years, mainly in the form of books or articles in learned journals. I did do an occasional newspaper article, first in England and then here, but not many. What suddenly catapulted me into this kind of prominence, I think, was two articles. One was an article which I published in the Atlantic Monthly in September '90. The editors gave it the title, The Roots of Muslim Rage. I was not happy with the title at the time. I complained to the editors, but I must admit that, and I do so publicly, that they were right and I was wrong. It was an appropriate title.
What was going on in the world in September of 1990?
Nothing very special. It was just that I had been studying the Middle East for a long time. I had been observing current changes in mood. I had been reading the current literature. And I had come to realize more and more that there was a growing hostility, more than hostility. Rage is not an inappropriate word, towards the Western world in general and the United States in particular. And in this article, I tried to explain what were the sources of this resentment. The second article was one which appeared in Foreign Affairs in '98. I read an article in an Arabic newspaper published in London, giving the text of a proclamation by a man I had not previously heard of, called Osama bin Laden, containing the text of his declaration of war on the United States. I thought this was an interesting text, so I published an article analyzing it and translating parts of it. And it seems that when things happened and people were looking around for someone to consult, these two articles were what came up on their computers.
When people disagree with you, what's the reason that you hear them disagreeing?
Well, there are various reasons, of course. There are people who disagree for scholarly reasons because their assessment of this or that problem or event is different from mine. But mainly the people who disagree are those who regard the whole discipline of Orientalist scholarship in which I grew up to be evil, to be a form of imperialism, a form of exploitation.
Why?
Well, you're not asking me to explain their view.
But at your core of beliefs, your political beliefs or how you see the world, can you give us examples? I mean, what are you politically? Or do you even consider yourself politically?
I don't identify myself I don't always vote for the same party. I vote for the individual rather than the party.
Do you consider yourself right or left?
I consider myself moderately conservative, but this wasn't always true. I have gradually moved towards the center and then slightly to the right, as is normal with the passing of the years.
Is there a political way of looking at this in American terms that you're used to teaching at Princeton? I mean, if you're on the right or the left, are you going to look at this issue in a certain way?
I don't think so. I think, obviously, we are all influenced by our basic philosophies, but I'm still old-fashioned enough to believe that history consists of facts as attested by evidence. I realize this is no longer generally accepted. Nowadays, evidence is unimportant, accuracy is unimportant. All that matters is narrative and the intention which inspires the narrative, but I don't share that view.
There's a quote in one of these articles, and I'm trying to find it right here. I can't put my finger on it, but basically you say Americans don't know much about history.
My point is that in this country, there isn't a great deal of interest and therefore of knowledge of history. The phrase, "that's history," means something is unimportant and irrelevant to present concerns. It is dismissing history as such, and one is constantly astonished and, I may say, appalled at the lack of knowledge of history, even among educated people. This is the more remarkable if one thinks that the universities of the United States are full of tenured historians. There must be tens of thousands of them turning out hundredweights of books, monographs, and so on history, all of very high quality, well, mostly of very high quality. And yet the general ignorance of history remains tested in a number of ways. You make an allusion to something that happened not so long ago, within my lifetime. Even educated, well-informed people look blank. Now, this is a major difference between the United States and these various cultures of the Middle East, where they have a very acute sense of history, a very keen awareness of the past. Now, I'm not saying that their perceptions of history are necessarily accurate. I mean, we all have our own particular slant to the way in which we view the past. But at least they know. I mean, for example, in the Iraq-Iran war between 1980 and 1988, the war propaganda of both sides, of both the Iraqis and the Iranians, made frequent allusions to events of the 7th century. Now, they didn't describe them or discuss them. They just alluded to them in passing, in the secure knowledge that their readers on both, their listeners and readers on both sides, Iraqi and Iranian, would pick up these allusions and understand them. The allusions were to the advent of Islam, to the coming of Islam to Iran, and the struggles between different factions in early Islam. They could allude to these in the sure knowledge that they would be understood. When Osama bin Laden, in one of his recent pronouncements, said, "We have suffered this shame and humiliation for more than 80 years," I haven't the slightest doubt that all his intended audience knew exactly what he was talking about. They didn't have to start scurrying around and looking up reference books and saying, 80 years, what happened 80 years ago? No, we did that here, they didn't.
What was it 80 years ago?
80 years, well, slightly more than 80 years ago, was the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was the last great Islamic empire. In 1918, along with its German and Austrian allies, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. Not only defeated, but occupied, partitioned, its capital occupied, its sultan a prisoner, and so on. This was seen as the ultimate point in the degradation and humiliation of the Islamic world.
Who defeated the Ottoman Empire?
The Allies, that's to say Britain, France, and the United States.
And what was the center of the Ottoman Empire? How big was it, both in territory and in population?
Well, at its height, the Ottoman Empire extended from the suburbs of Vienna to the frontiers of Iran and the Persian Gulf in the east, across North Africa as far as the frontiers of Morocco, and a large part of southeastern Europe. It was a very mighty power.
How was the Ottoman Empire defeated?
In a series of wars in which they were the losers. Sometimes they managed to rally, but it was a slow and painful process. And the end result was that they were driven from one province after another and eventually lost control even of their capital and their heartlands. Later they were able to get out of that because a remarkable man called Mustafa Kemal, later surnamed Atatürk, led a rising in occupied Anatolia and was able to drive out the Allied occupation forces and reassert Turkish independence. But this was not an Islamic victory. This was another Islamic defeat, because Kemal Atatürk was a secularist and a modernist and believed in separation between religion and the state. So that although this was, from a Turkish national point of view, it compensated for the final defeat and destruction of the Ottoman Empire, from the Muslim point of view, it was a worsening of the situation, because the Kemalists, having restored the independence of Turkey, proceeded to abolish the Sultanate and the Caliphate.
So when Osama bin Laden referred to 80 years ago, and everybody in the whole
I feel
Islamic
reasonably
world,
sure that everybody in the Middle East, at least, and probably elsewhere too, knew what he was talking about.
What happens to somebody who is in that part of the world when they hear him say something like that? What's their reaction to it?
The Caliphate was the headship of Islam, and Islam is seen as a single community. We in the Western world tend to think of a nation subdivided into religions. There is rather a religion subdivided into nations. The basic identity is the religious identity. One is first a Muslim, or whatever other religion it may be, and then subdivided. Now, these nation states of that part of the world are very new and very recent, and many of them are creations of the Western imperialist powers invented by Britain and France for the most part. But that doesn't mean to say that they are not ancient civilizations. They are very ancient civilizations, but they did not see themselves. They did not define themselves in national or territorial terms. They defined themselves by religious identity and political allegiance.
When you were referring to the 7th century, I assume one of the things you're referring to is the Prophet Muhammad.
Yes, the rise of Islam.
What can you tell us about him that might help us better understand why he is so revered and how he started?
He is revered because he was the founder of this religion. He brought them a book called the Quran.
And did he write it?
According to Muslims, it is of divine authorship, divine, eternal, and uncreated. It was revealed to Muhammad through the Archangel Gabriel, and he brought it to the Muslim people, to the people who became Muslims, I should say.
Where was he?
In Arabia, in Mecca and Medina. He was born in Mecca. This is again an interesting point. Life in Mecca became difficult for him. He was oppressed by the pagan rulers of Mecca. So he moved to Medina, where he managed to build up his strength and eventually returned to Mecca. This theme of exile and return is a recurring theme in Muslim history.
Now, Mecca and Medina, the two holy cities in Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
How far apart are they physically?
Oh, not very far apart.
Now, can you go, or can I go?
No. Non-Muslims are not allowed to set foot in the Hijaz.
Why? Do they say? Is it in the Quran?
No, but it's a saying attributed to the Prophet that there shall not be two religions in Arabia. Some take this as being limited to the Hijaz. Some take it to apply to the whole of Arabia. But certainly in the Hijaz, non-Muslims are not allowed to set foot.
Because you talk about Osama bin Laden's being first upset about what's going on between the two worlds over the American troops.
In Arabia. Yes.
In Arabia. Now, why would that be an insult?
Well, it is not Hijaz, but it is still part of Arabia. And for a Muslim, not only Osama bin Laden, but for any Muslim, a non-Muslim military presence on the Arabian Peninsula is, shall we say, troubling, to say the very least. And for many, it was much worse than that. I mean, even in the greatest days of the British Empire nibbled around the edges of Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Aden, but they took good care not to get involved on the mainland of the Arabian Peninsula, because they realized that this would really stir up a hornet's nest.
Go back to the Prophet. What was he like? Why was he? What was his life all about? How long did he live?
I think the important difference between the Prophet Muhammad and his predecessors is that he was successful during his lifetime. Moses, you will recall, was not allowed to enter the promised land. He led his people through the wilderness, but was not permitted to enter the promised land. Jesus was crucified. Muhammad did not suffer either of these disagreeable fates. It was not he that was put to death, but his enemies. He triumphed during his lifetime. So he created a state, first in Medina and then in Mecca, which he was able to conquer. So you have a prophet, the founder of religion, who was also a statesman, who during his lifetime became a head of state, which means that he promulgated and enforced laws, that he made peace and made war, and did all the other things that a head of state does. And those events form part of the core of memories that Muslims all over the world share. This is the sacred history, the scriptural history of Muslims. And it is therefore political in a sense that Christianity never was and that Judaism has long ceased to be.
Do you have any sense whether people who follow Islam revere Muhammad more or less as much as Christians revere Jesus?
Oh no, they make that point quite explicitly. For Muslims, Muhammad is not divine. He is a prophet, the chosen, the last, the greatest prophet of God, but not more than a human being. This is very clearly stated in Muslim teachings. They also revere Jesus as a prophet, but they say that the Christians made a monstrous error in calling him the Son of God. That, from a Muslim point of view, is blasphemy.
From a history standpoint, you also mentioned that Napoleon had something to do with the way people in that part of the world feel about the West.
Well, I wouldn't quite put it that way. Let me put it this way. Most historians of the region agree that what we might call the modern history of the Middle East begins in 1798. 1798, the process of defeat and withdrawal had already been going on for some time, but it was at the edges, so to speak. In 1798, the French Republic sent an expeditionary force to Egypt, commanded by a young general called Napoleon Bonaparte. At that stage, he wasn't yet Napoleon, he wasn't yet emperor. He was simply General Bonaparte in the service of the Republic. And General Bonaparte went to Egypt and taught the first appalling lesson that even a small West European army could enter, conquer, occupy and govern one of the heartlands of the Islamic Middle East with impunity. And the French stayed there for several years, and their arrival was the first terrible lesson. Their departure was the second one. The departure of the French from Egypt was not achieved by the Egyptians, nor by their suzerains, the Turks. It was accomplished by a squadron of the British Royal Navy, commanded by a young admiral called Horatio Nelson. So the first lesson is that a European power can come and do what they please. The second lesson is that only another European power can get them out. And that began 200 years when the scenario was more or less the same, though the roles were played by different actors. When the Middle East was the more or less passive object of the rivalries and power ploys of greater powers from outside the region. Sometimes it was Britain versus France, sometimes it was Britain versus Germany or versus Russia. In the final phase, it was the United States versus the Soviet Union, the two superpowers still playing the same game that was initiated by Bonaparte and Nelson. But that was the end of it, because President Bush and Gorbachev ended what Bonaparte and Nelson had started. They ended this imperial rivalry over the Middle East because they both withdrew. The Soviets, the Russians, I should say, since the Soviet Union collapsed. The Russians because they couldn't, the Americans because they wouldn't. They didn't choose to. That is not the American way. It's a point I was trying to make in the National Review article.
By the way, back to the New Yorker piece, and I'll give the dates here because folks might want to go get either the New Yorker piece or the National Review. The New Yorker was November 19th, 2001, and the National Review was December 17th, 2001. It might be interesting because one is a magazine that I think most people would say would be left of center, and the other would be right of center. How did the invitation come to you to write both of those pieces, and what were they asking for in both of those pieces?
Well, they didn't tell me what to write. They both asked me to write something about the current crisis and to deal with it in whatever way I chose, which I did.
They didn't care about your particular political persuasion when they asked you to do that?
Well, if they did, they didn't let me know about it. I didn't have any complaints.
Had you written for either magazine before?
Had I written for it? No, I hadn't.
And going back to what we were talking about, Napoleon in the Middle East, you mentioned in one of these pieces, I've read so much about what you said, I'm not sure where I found it, that the two big items that you need to talk about, Israel and oil, when it comes to the Middle East.
No, when it comes to defining American interests, not when it comes to the Middle East. It's not the same thing. But one defining American interests in the Middle East, oil, a vital source of supply, and I think probably in many respects the main problem of the region, both for its people and for outsiders. And the other is Israel, the small country which is surrounded by hostile neighbors and in which clearly the United States has an interest. Yes, it seems to me that those are the only two.
Start with oil. When was oil found over in that part of the world?
Towards the earlier, in the 20th century. It came in various stages. From the beginning of the century in Iran, then onwards. The development of oil made a tremendous difference in every respect. One of which I think is important and has not been generally mentioned. The kind of Islam that is represented by Osama bin Laden, this radical, extreme kind of Islam, did originate in Arabia, and as far back as the 18th century. And it would have remained in Arabia had it not been for oil. Let me explain what I mean. Imagine that some such group as the Ku Klux Klan or the Aryan Nation or one of those were suddenly to come into the possession of unlimited wealth and use that money to set up schools and colleges all over the world promoting their particular version of Christianity. Then you get an idea of what has happened to Islam as a result of the enormous wealth that oil has brought to some people in Saudi Arabia. It has enabled them to set up schools and colleges all over the Muslim world, teaching their brand of Islam, this kind of fanatical, extremist version of Islam, which has thus acquired a scope, an expansion, which it could never otherwise have had. Without oil money, this kind of Islam would have remained a fringe group in a marginal country.
Are you saying, in effect, by us buying all the oil we do, we're really funding this confrontation?
Yes, indirectly we are.
And you also make a point in one of your articles that the Far East and the European nations use far more oil than we do?
No, they use far more Middle Eastern oil.
That's what I mean.
Yes, I think so.
Why is that?
Well, because they haven't the Western Hemisphere sources of oil.
So go back to the oil again. 1930s or so, oil is founded out there, and
then it develops very rapidly. And of course, it suddenly transforms these rather simple pastoral economies with an injection of immense wealth. It has a very disruptive effect. And on the whole, I should say that oil has been a curse to the Arab world.
Why?
Precisely this reason. There's this old American dictum, no taxation without representation. What is sometimes overlooked is that the converse is also true, no representation without taxation. With oil revenues, they didn't need taxes, and therefore they didn't need assemblies to levy taxes, and they were made independent of public opinion in their own countries with this untold wealth accruing from oil revenues. This greatly strengthened the power of autocratic governments, far greater than it had ever been in the past. Now, traditional Islamic government is authoritarian, but it is not dictatorial or despotic. It is government under certain rules and so on. In modern times, the power of the ruler has been vastly augmented by these huge revenues, so that he doesn't need public support, public approval of his taxes. It has also been increased by all kinds of modern devices for